some of these people are rushed along to getting really drastic surgeries that they cannot come back from. And then it turns out something close to 30 or 33% or something like that end up regretting it, which is a pretty high regret rate. So I'm concerned about these things, and I'm always interested in the way that ideologies kind of form, and then the way that they cause people to do things that they just otherwise would never do.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, educator in Los Angeles, now serving far and wide through my online education platform, Patterdocs. And one of the things that I talk about that they don't talk about in schools a lot is what could kind of pejoratively be called like wokeness, critical social justice stuff. And it's been a circle that I've been kind of engaged in a lot over the last probably like 7 years. And one of the people that I've connected with in the past, we did a podcast together, is a filmmaker named Travis Brown. And I'm bringing him back on the program because he has a series coming out that's really incredible with some really amazing people. I'm excited to dive into it, called Uncomfortable Truths. It's the reality of gender identity ideology. And that's a great way to put it, gender identity ideology, because I've had 8 transgender people on the podcast. I've had 4 detransitioners on the podcast. This is the topic that I've talked about more than any other topic because we haven't sorted it out yet. There's a lot of language issues going on. It's very polarized. We're dealing with marginalized groups. People would talk about suicide of children and all this kind of stuff. We're also talking about like body mutilation of children. Like it's really, really emotionally charged, to say the least. And I think that we have to be storytellers. I talk a lot about artists and the importance of artists. And Travis is an artist, and his medium through filmmaking is a really important one to get these stories out, to really understand what's going on. So Travis, it's great to see you, man. I'm really excited to dive into this series, kind of what prompted it for you, and everything you've been up to for the past. It's been a couple of years since we talked, so it's good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so bring me into like, what prompted you? You're a filmmaker. You could kind of go down any road. You're a storyteller. What stories, stand out to you? And why is it that this gender identity ideology one, this like whether, you're the gender is a spectrum, and transgender and LGBTQIA plus 5, 7, whatever like, why is it that that's the one that you decided to like kind of pursue when it comes to all these different stories? Because one of the things that I get a lot is, this is such a small part of the population. It's so small. Like, why do you keep focusing on this, Will? It's like, I think it matters, even though it's small. I think it really matters. And I assume that you do too. So why did you land on this one?
Yeah. Yeah, it is small. It's still relatively small, but the numbers have been growing. As I think Stella O'Malley pointed out when I interviewed her, there's been a 4,000% increase in girls identifying as trans since about 2014, 2015. And I think it's about a 1,000% increase in terms of boys. This used to be a lot smaller before the internet, before social media, before a number of factors that made it kind of balloon outward and really become a social contagion. But in terms of why I'm interested in the topic, I mean, really, it was just an expansion of working on the Woke Reformation, which is a series I did a while ago, which was all about identity politics. And, it was largely in response to what happened with Trump and the George Floyd riots, and then all of these, DEI offices popping up all over the place. And all of this really backwards thinking and divisive thinking, in my opinion, when it comes to race and gender and all of that. So I thought, oh well, I'll cover trans or gender as just part of this series. So I reached out to Helen Joyce, who wrote a book called Trans, when ideology meets reality. Fantastic book, and she invited me to the first ever conference put on by GenSpect, which helps people, in this space, and that was in Ireland a couple years ago. And then I realized I could interview so many experts on the topic, journalists, biologists, doctors, and psychiatrists. And so I realized that this is a really complex topic and it deserves its own focus and its
Yeah.
own series. So I sort of split off and started that. But and maybe we can get into this a little bit in the future. But one of the things that interests me so much about these ideologies is how they're a replacement, in my view, for religion to some degree. For some people, they're not. You know, for like, let's say Buck Angel. Buck doesn't care about the ideology. Buck just feels more comfortable presenting as a
Right.
man. Buck is a biological woman, but wants to pass, look like a man. So takes testosterone, etc. And I don't really have any problem with adults doing this if they're well informed. And the model used to be, the wait and see model for adults. If they want to
Yeah.
live as the opposite sex, therapists would say, well, cross dress for a year or so and see what it's like to live as the opposite sex before we do any of these drastic, irreversible surgeries or hormones. That was a much more reasonable stance than what's happening now, which is people, including children, are rushed along to a medical pathway. And I've interviewed, detransitioner and spoken to many detransitioners at this point. And even as adults, they said that that is what happened to them. They just got rushed into it. Yeah, so I've interviewed a detransitioner and spoken to many, and it's clear that some of these people are rushed along to getting really drastic surgeries that they cannot come back from, and then it turns out something close to 30 or 33% or something like that end up regretting it, which is a pretty high regret rate. So yeah, so I'm concerned about these things, and I'm always interested in the way that ideologies kind of form, and then the way that they cause people to do things that they just otherwise would never do, or they would never condone, or they would never participate in, save this belief system. Because I'm just fascinated by belief, having grown up, in a religious household that was very fundamentalist, very, very strict. And so I've always been interested in, why do people believe these things? And more importantly, can we observe the outcomes of these beliefs and say, well, wait a minute, should we believe these things?
Yeah.
And should we examine our beliefs a little bit more closely? So that's really like the underlying motivation of just about everything that I do is I want people to think a little bit more carefully, a little bit more deeply about what they believe and why they believe it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I've had different detransitioners on my podcast too, and each one had a different reason for why they fell into that ideology. Chloe Cole, as a kid,
Mm,
turned out she was like autistic. She was just like kind of pushed
mm,
into it. I had Calvin Lunt on, and his was like internalized homophobia, which is something that Dr. Deborah
yeah,
So has talked about a bit. I had Chris Beck on, who has like PTSD because he's a Navy SEAL, and
mm,
then I just did a
yeah,
podcast recently with Diego Arien, who is really like wired differently, probably like the way that Buck Angel is like wired. Just
mm,
even Buck is pretty upfront. Like I have like a mental issue. Like this is the way
yeah,
my brain is wired. But then realize that like this is not leading to me being happier. So he,
yeah.
has detransition. But what's really interesting is the people who subscribe to this hardcore, and I have a very diverse kind of following on my social media across the political spectrum, is they definitely play that like Kafka trap like game, where they say
Mm,
like, the reason why they're detransitioning is because society doesn't accept them. But
hmm,
what's interesting about that is what I point out is like, but they are saying that that's not what it is. So like the LGBTQ kind of mob, quote unquote, is coming after people saying you actually are trans. To like this detransition I just talked to Diego, like he's getting it
mm,
all the time. They're dead naming him. They're calling him
mm.
her, even though like they're playing that same game
Oh,
that
interesting.
that has
Yeah,
been played against them. Because they like don't want to, because
yeah,
it's almost like a black conservative. It's like, oh, you're like an extra level of
right.
like traitor.
Right,
You
right.
see that too?
Internalized, yeah, racism.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I saw something similar growing up as a Christian, and I even as a Christian back then, I would hear people say, "Oh, well, this person's left the faith, therefore they were no longer really a Christian."
Yeah.
And even at the time, I thought, well, they may have sincerely believed it, and maybe now for whatever reason they just don't. I think that's possible. Just like people say, "Well, you were never really trans if you detransition now." Well. maybe they really thought they were and they had gender dysphoria or whatever the reason. So it's an interesting tactic that people use in any kind of belief system to say, oh, well, you were never really pure and truly part of the faith or the movement or the identity. And I think it's just a way to sort of buttress support for the people who hold those beliefs still to feel comfortable with it, I guess.
Mhm.
And maybe that's because those people are a little bit more fragile in how they approach their own belief system or their own identity. That's my armchair,
Yeah.
psychologizing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And like when you bring up like the religious aspect of this, and John McWhorter, a lot of people have talked about that. And I think
Yeah,
it's obvious that someone like Peter Boghossian, who's a mutual friend of ours, like he was always against that like dogmatic element of religious faith, and then that just was an easy just like switcheroo to like wokeness. And John
yeah,
Haidt has pointed out that this is filling that religious vacuum. I had Colin Wright on the podcast a while ago. I think
yeah.
he's in your series, and
Mhm.
he talked about how a lot of the woke stuff started in the new atheist movement, because you get rid of that
Yeah,
container for a higher power or for a system of morals and beliefs and stuff like that. Then something has to fill in. What I've been, because I'm a person, I'm a Christian. I kind of bulk it. I
right.
call myself like a Jesus follower. I'm a fan of Jesus. But what I do is I teach apologetics. So I do it online, but I also do it at my church. And I come in,
Mm,
I'm like, guys, this is not the place. If you're from a background, probably like yours is, Travis, which is like, you don't ask questions, you just obey, you just follow this. This is not the place for that. Let's ask all the questions. Let's go. Let's get into the quantum mechanics of things. Let's like figure this out. And I think that whether or not it leads you to a path of faith or not, I think that the modern current generation, the 2025 America and 25 of the world, like we just have an abundance of information that this like, don't look over here, don't look in that box, don't ask questions thing. People who are rational, reasonable thinkers. That's just not going to fly for them. I think there are people.
mhm.
I mean, I think that there are people who could be very reasonable. There's a lot of scientists and very, well respected Alvin Plantinga or whoever, who are, John Lennox and people like that who, through asking questions led them to faith. And there's other people who we know,
Right.
yourself, others who ask questions and it doesn't lead them to that. But I think that you have to allow that element of asking questions and then looking at the evidence. And some people will look at the evidence and go on one side and some will go on the other. But the idea of you can't ask questions, that's always been my issue with the woke stuff. Is like it
Yeah.
has to be wrong because you can't question it. So just that on its surface is like no, and that's
Hmm.
that's why even with I stayed away from any kind of religious faith for so long, because I was kind of in that circle of understanding too. Where like I have questions about this. Did humans and dinosaurs, where does Neanderthals and Homo erectus fit in with the Adam and Eve story and things like that, as
Right.
opposed to diving in and learning more from people who know more than I do and can answer those kinds of questions in different ways. I just think that's just when you're not sure which side is the right side. If one of them says you can't ask questions, that to me is just that's the wrong side.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's inherently authoritarian, and I think that that's why I'm so anti-authoritarian. For whatever reason, it's just my way my brain is structured, and plus my experiences, developmental history. But
Yeah.
that's exactly right. If people are telling you, no, you can't ask that question, well, then the next question is there's another question. Why? Why can't I
Yeah.
ask this question?
Yeah.
And you definitely see this with certain pockets of Christian fundamentalism. It's not as popular as I once believed it to be because that was just my whole world. It was a small world, and then I got outside that and I realized, okay, well, some believing Christians are not this way, just like any other religion. I mean, you have a little bit more of a tradition in Judaism where it's all about the dialectic and it's all
Mhm.
about questioning, and I appreciate that. But then, yeah, when it comes to these modern ideologies that are, in my view, trying to kind of fill a void in a really unorganized, chaotic way, and they're saying, well, no, I mean, obviously men can become women. You can't question that. Of course, people are born in the wrong body, just like you could potentially be born gay or lesbian or whatever. And so that's why I think a lot of people I mean, there's so many reasons why people get swept up in this and think that it's legitimate is that I think it's providing kind of filling a void in people's lives in a way. They have something to fight for if they're not trans, or if they are trans identified. They either it's some internal issue that they're dealing with, or gender dysphoria, or they're getting swept up in the ideology and therefore apply themselves wholly to this because they, as Lisa Marciano says in my series, it allows them to kind of transcend themselves, to
Yeah.
focus on something bigger than themselves and higher, that they can actually change who they are. So that's a very enticing thing. I don't think that necessarily people are thinking about this consciously very much, like, oh, this is filling a spiritual void in my life. That's why I'm pursuing it. But I do think that that is one of the reasons that so many people get swept up, whether they're on the sidelines being supporters or they're just the people who are going through the process themselves. And my point with the first episode is toward the end that I'm wanting people to find healthier ways to sort of fill that void and other forms of meaning and structure and purpose in their lives, which is really challenging without, some of us are just not going to be religious. That's just a fact. Some of us just can't believe some of these religious dictates or, belief systems. So there has to be, I think, again, it comes back to this anti-authoritarian thing. I want people of faith to be able to practice their faith as long as they're not harming anyone. I
Yeah.
want people like Buck and other people who I may disagree with in certain aspects to be able to live the lives that they want. I don't want to control what other people do or think or say, just as I want the same thing from them. Uh, and so, it's challenging ultimately to find something that's meaningful and gives your life like a narrative and a structure and a purpose without religion. I don't think it's impossible. Plenty of us do it, but I do think that as we see structured religion, Christianity in particular, declining, we see the manifestation of these cult-like movements that really cause, I think, even more harm than,
Yeah.
yeah.
What do you think it is like for people? Because I'm with you. Like we say, like some people, maybe yourself included, some of our mutual friends, like they just won't be religious. Like, is it like your brain structured in a way that's more okay with not having answers? Like you're more
Mm.
okay with the pursuit of truth and not landing, and other people like need to land somewhere. Like, what do you think it is? Like, it's got
That's
to be something in
possible.
the structure
Yeah.
of our brain that makes people go like, all right, well, I need some sort of container to fill that higher power, idea. And then there's other people that are just like okay with like, no, I don't know, like whether like you fall into like agnosticism, or it could just be a materialist atheist. Like,
Right.
like in the people you've talked to, what stands out as like a personality trait, or what do you think that is?
Yeah, I do think it's a bit different for everyone, but that is something I've thought about and talked with my other non-believer friends about, this idea that maybe there's it's tough to describe this in a way that doesn't put us on some kind of pedestal or something, because that's
Mhm.
not what I'm trying to do. But
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you're right that some people are just more uncomfortable not knowing, or just it's saying this is just not something we have an answer for. Um, but yeah, it's hard to say. But I do think I love Carl Sagan, big fan of Carl Sagan. He said I'm obsessed with reality. He wanted to know, and then he was also very honest about we should be very humble because there's so much that we don't know, right?
Yeah.
And so for some of us, um, that leads us to say, okay, well, you know, maybe there's some kind of higher power. We don't see empirical evidence for it, therefore we can't draw this conclusion. Even though there are stories and a big movement and a big rich traditional history pointing in that direction, but many of us just can't believe it, and um, for primarily often for the lack of empirical evidence, but sometimes it's just a matter of being okay with not knowing what happens after we die, or whether or not there's some other spiritual realm where things are happening. And then what I hope for people is it often doesn't happen, like you said with the new atheist movement. They just kind of chucked all spirituality out the window. But what I hope for people is they find something else to give themselves a tight knit sense of community, and also something else to sort of focus their lives around that's positive and life affirming and meaningful. As I just the new atheist movement just rarely mentioned that. I mean, Sam Harris talked about that a little bit. He's probably the only one that I can think of. Um, but I don't think there's enough talk about that for those of us who, you know, who just don't believe or can't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, do you, what are your thoughts on the education system? Because that's kind of my world, um,
Hmm.
and it seems like I've talked to, National Teachers of the Year, and they are very much, you know, in lockstep with the LGBTQ kind of, the identity ideology. And the way that
Hmm.
I believe that the reason is you get into teaching to take care. It's the empathy of, like, caring for the needy type of thing. And the flip side of that empathy is the mother bear stuff. So you come after the trans kids and I will rip your head off. So they get
Right.
very aggressive when you come after that. But it seems like a lot of the education space is very much, in line with this ideology when it comes to gender. What are your thoughts on, like education and how that's kind of been lost in this ideology, this religion, essentially, as well? Because it's something that I
Yeah.
see a lot. I was kind of like an island of people be like questioning this, even, like, 5 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious about your experiences because it's something I'm not too familiar with. I just
Mhm.
see and hear and read about this manifesting in, even K through 12 schools, not just in college. In college, it's pretty obvious, but
Yeah.
as you said, you have these people who want to protect and support these young, vulnerable people, and they are young, vulnerable people,
Yeah.
people that have gender dysphoria or think that they're born in the wrong body or think that they need, X, Y, and Z surgery or puberty blockers or hormones. But I guess what's disappointing is that there's not a lot of critical thinking, or there's at least a lack of critical thinking in certain areas where, again, I think it comes back to, okay, we were wrong about the gay issue. People, as far as we can tell, are born this way. Maybe there's environmental influence. I don't think that really matters whether there is or isn't. It doesn't really, no one's getting irreversible surgeries because they love someone of the same sex
Mhm.
or are sexually
Right.
attracted to someone of the same sex. There's nothing that happens, and Camille Kiefel pointed that out to me, who's a detransitioner. She's said all these people are saying it's just like being gay, but the reality is you don't have to do anything if you're
Yeah.
gay. You just are. And so I think some of these teachers and some of these sort of social justice warriors are like, oh, we got this wrong about gay people and we marginalize them, and there's a legitimate complaint there. So they want to be on, as they say, the right side of history.
Yeah.
They want to be forward thinking. They want to think, okay, well, if being gay is a thing when you're young, maybe being trans is a thing. Maybe people can be born in the wrong body. Therefore, they just take it on board without really thinking too critically about it. I mean, if you think about it for just a few seconds or a couple minutes, it's like, well, what do you mean born in the wrong? How could anyone be born in the wrong body? We have bodies, we have brains. It doesn't really matter if they're a little bit more feminized or masculinized,
Yeah.
if we're boys or girls. Ironically, it is kind of counter the liberal impulse in a sense because really, now we have these clinicians and some teachers and stuff saying, well, oh, the boy wants to put a beret in his hair, therefore it must be trans, or the girl wants to play with trucks, therefore
Yeah.
she was born in the wrong. But I mean, that's absurd. Like we just let them do what they want, let them play with dolls if they're boys or whatever, paint their nails. It's really not a big deal. But I don't know. I guess they think they're forward thinking, and that's why they even put it into some of the curriculum. They teach kids about gender at a young age and just get them confused. And I'm sure you've probably seen some of
Oh
that.
my gosh, I have so many stories. I was working with a,
Mm.
a teacher who I think is in Maryland, and her daughter went to a school, and, like, the teacher's assistant or something was trans, and,
Mm.
like, in the beginning of the year, kindergarten. And then throughout the year, her daughter and some other people were, like, going around the playground with, like little notes and, like, um are you cisgender, or are you, non-binary? And if a kid would say cisgender, they put a little frowny face. And then if they would say
Oh my
non-binary, they put a
God.
smiley face. And then this is kindergarten. And then by the end of the year, I think the number was seven kids in a class of like 18 identified as some other gender. So like there is this
Oh
social
wow.
contagion element. You
Yeah.
can't ignore that. And like, and I get told these stories also. Like my cousins in Boston were telling me about there's some stuff going on in their school. I have all these people that come up to me. I have friends in Long Beach who are like, yeah, my daughter came home. I was like, is it okay if I'm still a girl? Like they don't know that I've been talking about this. They don't know that I'm like
Yeah.
friends with people like you that have been like talking about this and like put this as like their soapbox box issue. They just know I'm a teacher. Like, oh, you're a teacher. Are you seeing this stuff?
Mm.
So it's not that small. Like I think that
Yeah.
they're just the reality is that there's people who are born. I have a friend who's she identifies as like pansexual.
Mm.
Kind of attracted to whatever. And I was just asked her, she's like really reasonable though. And I was just
Mm.
like, have you ever taken a testosterone test? She's like, nah, but bro, it's probably super high. Like there might be just like girls that just have like a lot of
Sure.
testosterone and guys that just don't.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
then that's going to manifest in certain ways. And that's always existed. But then now there's this ideology that comes in and says, oh, here's actually what you are. It's exactly what you're saying. Here's what you are. And instead of having more masculine women and feminine men, now we're kind of shifting people into these boxes. And a lot of it is just stereotypical. I mean, a lot of it's just stereotypes.
Right.
So Dylan Mulvaney whole
Exactly.
thing,
Yeah.
thing was just like, oh, you're just acting like a stereotypical girl. That's not, how is that advancing? How is that good for women? You know?
Right. Right. Or sometimes they act even more girly than 99% of girls act, and they
Yeah.
think that that's somehow very feminine and somehow makes them a woman, which it's really a caricature, obviously. But yeah, it's silly. And again, it just to me, if you just step outside of it I think what happens also, along with getting caught up with trans as a new rights movement, as Helen Joyce lays out in her book, it's not really a new rights movement. Is that people get confused because they bring in intersex. Oh, well, there's intersex people. There are people born with,
Yeah.
DSDs. There's like 40 different DSDs, which are disorders of sexual development, something like that. And, they can have ambiguous genitalia, or the,
Mhm.
testicles can be inside for a long time or whatever. But, a huge percentage of those people, as far as I can tell, talking to people like Buck and others, Deborah So, that they don't identify as trans. It actually has very little, if anything, to do with the
Yeah.
trans movement. Many of the trans people just say they have, a man just says they have a woman trapped inside, but they have no ambiguous genitalia. This has
Right.
nothing to do with that.
Right. No.
It's either autogynephilia or something. There are two types of males that want to transition generally, which is having autogynephilia, which is being attracted to yourself as a woman, or what they call HSTS, homosexual, transsexual, someone that just wants to pass as the opposite sex. And again, some of that is from internalized homophobia, or just not feeling comfortable being attracted to the same sex, so they want to appear as the opposite sex. So there's a host of reasons that people get drawn into this. And again, I guess for me, it's sort of weird. I've gotten almost more backlash from the people that I agree like 99% with
Yeah.
than trans people. I mean, I've had some trans people block me and be like, "Oh, this is ridiculous," when I post a trailer or whatever. But there's just so much infighting on the gender critical side of things and the radical feminists, and it's just it's depressing because so many. I have reached out to many people to talk about this, and Peter Boghossian has a lot of connections, and we've reached out to so many people who would otherwise, agree with us and want to put out this message and have me on their show or whatever. And then a huge percentage of them will explicitly say no because Buck Angel's in it. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, well,
Uh,
but what is it that you disagree with that Buck has said? I give people advanced copies of the film, or they've seen the film, and there's nothing that they will articulate that they disagree with in terms of what Buck is saying, but they can't have anything to do with Buck. So it's
yeah.
or if I just take a nuanced position on using pronouns, these people will just freak out at me and say that, oh, well, you're harming women and children, and I'm just like, well, that's the opposite of what I want to do. That's I came into this for the opposite reason.
Right, of course, and,
So
so let's talk about it. And I love Buck. I think he's great. I talk to him every once in a while,
yeah,
and I mean, the fact is, it's got to be really frustrating because he was actually a pioneer for like he calls it transsexual for the transsexual movement.
right,
Like, I mean, like the '90s, like what he had to go through and stuff like that to be his like authentic self. Like using like their language and stuff. to now be called like a transphobe is so crazy because he's drawing a line.
Right.
You have to draw a line in the sand. I mean, that's the idea. Like progressivism, it's like progressing towards what? Like where are you going to draw your line? And I
Mm.
think that just
Yeah.
it's like the order chaos Jordan Peterson thing. Like too much chaos is just you don't draw lines anywhere. And he's just decided to
Yeah.
draw certain lines when it comes to like kids or something like that. Like there's certain lines that we
Yeah.
have to draw. And
Exactly.
I think they just don't want to draw any lines.
Yeah. Yeah. And then for a certain contingent of people, the line isn't stringent enough. You know, there's the was it Posey
Yeah.
Parker, hold the line. You know, and a lot of the people who, including her and who are fans of her, just they hate Buck. They hate people like me. They hate people like Stella O'Malley because maybe we include a trans person in the documentary, or we talk to somebody who we disagree with, or whatever. And so yeah, it's really hard because I know Buck gets a lot of it too from both sides. You know, he gets a lot of hate from the trans people who you'd think would reasonably agree with him, and then a lot of hate from the other side that's saying, oh, well, you're just not drawing the line, you know, well
Yeah.
enough, or you claim things like, oh, he encourages young girls to transition, and I'm like, no, that's not true. But yeah, so it's just such a like it's a toxic space, and I'm hoping to just kind of release this, get it out there, and then move on to another topic because it's I don't know. It doesn't seem as fruitful as I'd like it to be. I hope it is. I hope it helps people think through these things. But it's just like,
People
man,
seem to be locked in. Yeah. So one of the things I
yeah,
do obviously is like with the techniques from with Peter's book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. Love that book.
yeah,
Give it to my civics class. The is like the process of trying to steel man other positions. So one of
right,
the topics, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is like the issue of passing is an interesting one
mm,
because if Buck can
yeah,
pass, so he can walk into a guy's room, no one cares, no one says anything or sees anything, whatever, just goes into a stall, does his thing.
yeah,
Okay. But if you're not passing, life is a lot harder. It's a lot different. You get treated differently. It's probably like being like to some degree like being like light skinned compared to dark skinned. Like it's just like different
mm,
kinds of things. I have friends that are black, but they don't even look black. Like
yeah,
What's a Meghan Markle? Like I didn't know
mm,
that she was black. Like because I was
oh
watching
yeah,
all
yeah,
these news stories about like how like the royal family's racist and stuff. I turned to my wife and I was like, racist against who? She's like, well, she's black. I was like, she's black? I
mm,
had no idea. She
yeah,
just looked like a white girl to me. So like her experience is going to be very different than someone who's very dark skinned black. You know what I mean? So there's this
right,
issue of passing, but then where that gets really tricky, I think, is one of the best ways to be able to be passing is to start transitioning before puberty. So you start with the
yeah.
puberty
That's
block,
why
you
they
start with
started
the
pushing it.
hormones and all
Yep.
that. So early transitioning. So if the way to get a better existence like Buck Angel has, even though he transitioned after puberty, but like if it would be
Yeah.
easier to get people to be accepted in the world, if we're like, hey, you do you just get accepted, then you'd have to transition early. That starts the whole thing of doing this with the kids. So it like I was trying to figure out like
Yeah.
what's the best argument I can come up with for why we should transition kids. And like I think that's
I
like the
see.
one that I've kind of come up with. But I'm curious to your thoughts on that whole just the
Yeah.
concept of passing and how that plays a role in who supports this and who doesn't.
Yeah, well, to continue the steel manning, I think you're right. That's probably that is what a lot of people say, and that is why they started doing this. Clinicians thought, oh well, we want these kids to grow up and be their true selves, whatever that means, and pass as the opposite sex because they feel more affinity with the opposite sex. Therefore, if we start the puberty blockers, they won't develop the secondary sex characteristics, and they'll pass more easily. So that is the line of thinking generally. I mean, there are some kind of creepy weirdos that do these things for other reasons, but a majority of people, I think, are wanting to help these vulnerable kids. The problem is, well, there are many problems, but two primary ones. Something I learned from interviewing the sociologist Michael Biggs was that, well, when the kids, especially the boys, take puberty blockers, I don't want to get too gruesome, but the genitalia don't develop properly or to the right size, and then when they go to do an inversion, treatment, there's not enough, material there to work with, and they have to actually take skin from intestines, etc. So it's actually not a good treatment pathway. That there
Interesting.
are so many health complications with doing this early, and of course, because you're stopping, you're halting puberty. Of course, things are going to follow from that. I mean, there are all sorts of other problems like bone density problems, brain development problems. There are all kinds of lifelong issues that have nothing to do with passing or not passing that we're now becoming aware of. So that alone is enough to want to be like, wait a minute, we've done this for a while. We need to pause on this and see what's going on. There's the famous Dutch study where supposedly this was a really successful trial, and I think it was done in the early 2000s, or I forget if 90s. There's so many dates and figures in my head, but this is held as like the gold standard for transing kids, for the lack of a better term. And it turns out that their methodology was extremely flawed, and one of them died from surgical complications. Some of them didn't participate in the follow-up study, and more kind of insanely, they actually swapped the questionnaires for the follow-up questionnaires. So, the boy who transitioned to look like a girl, they would say, well, I don't know if this was an accident or how it happened, but they would say, well, are you bothered by your periods anymore? And they would say no. And they're like, oh, great, success. Well, but that's a biological boy. They never had periods. So there were all these problems with the questionnaires that completely, confounded the data. So it's actually a very poor study, even though it's the gold standard. So, aside from that, then you have the other really obvious problem which is just because someone at a young age may want something doesn't mean we should give it to them. I mean, everyone knows this. You know this. You have kids. Right. So it's just patently obvious. I mean, this is why we don't let kids drink alcohol, because of the health effects and because of making stupid decisions. This is why we don't let kids get tattoos, et cetera, et cetera. So we have all these laws in place that are totally reasonable. Wait till you're 18 or 21 for this or that. But they're trying to erase these laws for kids for this steel-manned reason of, oh, well, we want them to live a better life in the future. But then it turns out, well, a lot of them actually don't want this, or they were confused, or they have autism, or they were caught up in a social contagion.
Mhm.
So there are all kinds of reasons to not do it. And I think the data is just overwhelmingly on that side of things.
Yeah, I think so too. You've got an uphill battle, man, because people are so kind of locked into this, and can you believe it's been 5 years since COVID? It's so crazy. Time just like
Yeah.
changed. The way that time works has just changed. But it's hard now for people to change their mind. It's really hard to switch out of that. The guy that I just had on,
Yeah.
Diego, I mean, he was trans. I mean, it was wild. I don't know if you saw that, but like he
Hmm.
looked like it's like a hot chick. You know what I mean? And then now he's
No.
like completely out of it. And
Yeah.
I was like, you know what? Like props. He's very effeminate. You could tell like he has that kind of wiring and stuff, but he actually you had Jesus
Hmm.
it was like his way out. So like he prayed away the gay. And like there's something
Mm.
about this that's very interesting, because I think that it's like one of the things that gets you out of for like 12 steps. It's like
Mm.
that there is this idea that to overcome something that's really difficult, to a belief in a higher power seems to be one of the ways to do that. I mean, I think psychedelics there's evidence for that too, but I think a belief in a
Right.
higher power it's one of the reasons why it's part of the 12 steps. And I think that, it's very interesting to
Mm.
watch Diego go through this, because he's actually very courageous, because he turned his back against like this whole community. They're all coming after him. It was really hard. He had to get the surgery, like he had to get boobs in, then boobs out, like all that kind of stuff. I think people are
Wow.
just so locked in that they just can't turn back now. So you have this uphill battle. If you're trying to tell this
Yeah.
story, you're trying to bring people toward the truth, like uncomfortable truths. And how do you win them over? Is it the power of story? John Haidt says our brain's a story processor, not a logic processor. I think a lot of times, Travis,
Yeah.
about that sea turtle. Remember the sea turtle with the straw in its nose? I think about that
Oh, yeah.
story. And I think about like that was one sea turtle off the coast of Costa Rica where they just dumped the
Hmm.
garbage right in the ocean and stuff like that. But that one story got,
Yeah.
mega giant Starbucks to start using plastic straws for a long time. Like the power of like one story is you don't talk about how there's a million kids starving in Africa. You tell a story about Sally and you tell her story in
Right.
detail. Like,
Yeah.
like I don't, what was your mindset if you're trying to actually bring people to pay attention to what's actually happening here? Like
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
your how do you do that as a storyteller, as an artist?
Yeah, well, I think just using narratives is a good start, because you can spout data at people all you want, but then people can look at other sources of data, whether or not the data is falsifiable or corrupt or whatever. It's hard to win people over with data, and Peter talks about that in his book. It usually just closes people off and makes them shut down. So I do think Jonathan Haidt is right, and Jordan Peterson, when they talk about the importance, and Benjamin Boyce, of narrative and of
Narratives.
story. Because as Haidt talks about in his book, The Righteous Mind, we have this sort of elephant, which is our intuition and our emotion, and we have the rider on top, which is reason. The writer is really just writing. He's not really directing. The elephant is just sort of going where it wants to go. And he talks about in the book that the way to sway people's elephants, or their emotions, their intuitions, is through sort of social pressure and social norms, and one of the ways to do that is through storytelling. It's not just throwing facts. I mean, I try to include a lot of facts and a lot of data in my series, but I also try to use personal stories and music and different things to hopefully sway a person in a particular direction, not necessarily that they have to agree with everything that I'm saying, but just to, again, be emotionally swayed so that they will then stop and think, oh, wait a minute. Because whenever I see a powerful film, it sticks with me and I think about it later, regardless of whatever conclusion I come to, or whatever. I think the important thing is to, reach people in a moving way, in a kind of a visceral way. And that's, one of the reasons I chose to put Buck in the film, aside from the fact that I love Buck and I like, most of what he says. I also thought, well, I was living in Portland. I know a lot of progressives, a lot of liberals. What is going to reach people like them? Well, someone who's gone through this
Right.
experience and
Yeah.
who speaks very powerfully about it. So yeah, I think that is the way to go in terms of really wanting to capture an audience and bring them along with you through storytelling.
Yeah. It's hard, because when I had my conversation with Chloe Cole, like I was like holding back tears because that's the age that I've always
Yeah.
taught, and I was like,
Mm.
but then I send it to like my very progressive LGBTQ ideology people, and they're just like, no, like they're just, it's
Mm.
like, wow, like you don't connect it. This is a child who's going through this really hard thing. Like it's it's
Yeah.
it's really interesting how these like people that I think would identify as being very emotionally connected and empathetic and stuff, but when you're viewed as a threat, then you're just like on the outs. It's really interesting. But I'm glad that you're doing it. I think it's a really important thing. And I do also think that reality bats last. I think that history is going to look back and they're going to go, "Whoa, were you nuts?" I mean, Europe is already banning a
Yeah.
lot of this stuff. Like it's it's
Right.
inevitable. We're not going to move in a direction where the norm is that little kids who are more masculine or feminine are going to get these reassignment surgeries and stuff like that. Like that's not. I just don't see any possibility that we're going to continue in the trajectory that we've been. I think it's already turning around now. So I think that your
Yeah.
your documentary is going to be essentially one way of being like, okay, yeah, he was calling it out here, and I think people are now more on the fence than they were before. You can see this with the election of Trump and everything like
Yeah.
that. It's all
Right.
kind of together. So it's coming at a nice time where people can like start to be like, okay, I'm open up to this idea a little bit. Then they can watch your film and be like, oh yeah, that's what I thought it was.
Yeah, yeah, that's the hope. I mean, there have been
Yeah.
people, talking about this for a long time, like Sue Evans, who was blowing the whistle at Tavistock, the JIDS at Tavistock back in 2005. So even before the influx, before the increase in kids identifying as trans, even before that, she was saying, well, we're not really doing this in the right way. Even these kids that are coming now are being rushed along to, puberty blockers, et cetera. So, her and her husband have been talking about that for a long time. Obviously, Helen Joyce and all these people have been sort of sounding the alarm about it. And was just lucky enough to get them in the film. So, the more people talk about it, the more they realize, like, oh, wait a minute, people have been talking about this for a while. There are many doctors and scientists and therapists and journalists pointing out this problem. The better, because yeah, it's done a lot of harm. But I agree with you. I think it is shifting. I think more people are waking up to how much of a problem this is, and so yeah, I hope there's a continued cultural shift to a more of a wait and see attitude, and let's not do these things to kids that are very vulnerable and they, may regret it.
Yeah, and and you're doing the taking the risk, as am I, even for talking about this as much as I do, of just being labeled a transphobe, and you hate kids and you want these people to commit
Right.
suicide, and even though that the suicide data seems to be completely, debunked now, but like the idea that if you don't
Yeah.
transition, you're more likely to commit
Yeah.
suicide. But I think that's the risk that you have to take, and it
Right.
actually is from a caring standpoint. It really is. I mean, I'm a school teacher. I mean, like I'm not trying to hurt kids. I know you're not trying to hurt kids. Like
Yeah.
we're that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring data here. We're trying to bring information here.
Right.
We're trying to tell stories here so that we can do this right. And if you already transitioned, you already went down that road, like there's things you can do. You can be an advocate. There are people like Buck, like Chloe Cole, Xander Keg, this person Diego that I'm talking to now, all these people that are going out
Mhm.
and they're speaking out against it because of what they experience. So there's a lot of different routes that you can go to down. It's not like too late for a lot for people. Like there's a lot of things you can do, but we're just headed in the direction of I think the inevitable, you know.
Yeah. 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 I hope so. And I think so. I'm, now wondering what the next sort of insane belief system that's going to come in and take over people's minds. But I did want to ask you a question, if you don't mind, because I'm
Yeah, let's
curious.
go.
I don't know what stance you've taken on this, but I know some Christians have said, oh, well, the problem with wokeness is the solution for that problem is coming back to God or coming back to Christianity. And there are two problems I see with this, and I'm curious
Yeah,
what
yeah.
you think. One is that, I mean, some of us just won't believe, right? It's just not going to happen. And then secondarily, I see, in some churches there are a lot of trans flags. There are drag queen story hours in the church. So a lot of Christians have even adopted this. They
Hmm.
tend, as far as I can tell, to be the more progressive liberal churches, and the more conservative churches reject it. And I'm curious what you think about this idea that, because I'm trying to broaden it and say, well, no, I don't think coming back to God is the solution. It might work for some people, but clearly this ideology, wokeness, has infested churches as well, not just the secular world.
Yeah.
So I'm just
Yeah.
curious what you think.
Oh, well, I mean, as far as like the woke churches go, I think that there's a lot of like people who are part of that, kind of agreeable mentality when it comes to even in churches. So
Mm,
it's like, so I think that there are people who are like woke and like on the pulpit saying like, whatever, Jesus was
right.
trans or something, the crazy stuff. But I think there's also there's an element here of bring people in.
Mm,
When I had an issue with Matt Walsh because he did that tweet a
mm,
couple years ago. It was called like a sincere message to Dylan Mulvaney. I don't know if you saw that, but it
mm,
was really
no.
harsh. It was like you're a
Mm,
disgusting human being. You're a deep fake human being. No one respects you. No
mm,
one like. It was really, really. It was just. He was trying to be as mean as he possibly could to Dylan Mulvaney. And
mm,
Matt Walsh's bio is Christian speaker. Blah blah blah. I think he's Catholic, but it's
right.
essentially Christian speaker. And I was thinking like, well, that's not when I say like I'm Christian, like I followed like Jesus and I'm like, okay, Jesus is a good role model
Mm,
for me. So like I'm gonna try and live like
right.
him as best I can, and I'm gonna fall short. So Matt Walsh, that's not acting like Jesus. What I said
Mm,
in like the video I made is like Matt Walsh, what you should have done is invited Dylan Mulvaney over for a Sunday lunch or a Wednesday
mm,
lunch or a Wednesday dinner, sat down, been like, tell me about your life. Who are you? Why do you think this way? Like build that, and then through a relationship, kind of like Daryl Davis, like
right.
through a relationship, you guide them out of this kind of way that you see as wrong. So I think there's an element of people in churches who are trying to do that. They're like putting up the flag, like
Mm,
come in, and then through fellowship and through the word, then you'll steer out of this lifestyle. But maybe I'm just giving them the benefit of the doubt because I don't know. My church doesn't have like trans flags and stuff, but we do have
oh, okay.
gay
Okay.
people there. And it's like,
Sure.
that cliche of church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. So like you come all
Mm,
broken people. So you have a proclivity to be attracted to the same sex, or you have a proclivity to just be a womanizer. You have a proclivity to drink a lot of alcohol and beat your wife, like whatever it is. Then you steer away from that kind of thinking. But as far as like the cure for wokeness, I don't know. I think that there might be people, I mean, clearly there are people like you who are just like, I'm okay not having answers. But then for the people that need some sort of container, some sort of like, how do I live my life? Why are we here? How did the universe start? Like whatever it is.
Hmm.
I think especially the morals one. Because you have abandoned like
Mm.
the Ten Commandments or like morals, the word sin is like to miss the bullseye. So like if
Hmm.
you miss the bullseye, like the best way to miss the bullseye is just to not even have a bullseye. So you're not even aiming for anything. So I think a lot of wokeness is like, what do we know is wrong? Racism? Yeah, okay, cool. Then anti-racism is obviously right. And it's just like it's overly simplistic. It hasn't been like up against a lot of scrutiny. So I think that I think there has to be something that replaces it. Because I think that's what we
Mm.
saw. There was like that meme of like, Sam Harris was saying something saying like, we get rid of religion and we'll all be, rational, reasonable people. But how many people are
Right.
built like Sam Harris? And there's like the bus getting hit by
Yeah.
the train. It says like men can get pregnant. So I think that for those
Right.
people,
Right.
they need something to replace it because we're not all built like Peter Boghossian. You know what I mean? We're not like so.
Yeah.
So I think for them, I think it's a better. I think Christianity would be a better choice than wokeness. I think
Mm.
if it's
Mm.
actually practiced right, but I think that there's also dangers to the way that it's practiced because of like what I said about Matt Walsh, and that bothered me as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, but like,
Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that view that some people, their lives are better off with these belief systems, even though I think that, I don't agree with them. I think they're false or there's no evidence for it. But I think that, yeah, some people are better off with a certain set of beliefs that guide them in a way that's useful and helpful and productive. I don't think it obviously doesn't need to be for everyone. So allowing the openness for that is important, and then encouraging those people who don't have this kind of belief system, who can't believe these things, to find some other way to fulfill their lives, to be focus on meaningful life is super crucial. And I think that's what sometimes gets lost when very religious people are like, well, no, everyone needs to go back to God. Everyone needs to join the church. I mean, even Jordan Peterson has kind of gone that route a little bit with his
yeah,
message to the churches, which frustrated me. It's like, oh, I don't care what young men think. They just need to show up and they need to do. Well, it's like, no, I mean, some people just don't, and that's fine. And if you say that everyone needs to go to church and just set aside their doubts, that is authoritarian. I mean, maybe it's not, maybe you're not going to enforce it politically, but socially, that's an authoritarian mindset, in my view.
yeah, well,
As
yeah,
far as,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, no, I'm with you. Like that's what I'm not. That's why like my area that when I talk about faith and stuff like that, it's always through like reason. Like when you say like the evidence, like I would like be like, well, what about the DNA code that Francis Collins pointed out, or what about the
Mm,
James Webb saying that the universe had a start? Like there's some stuff there. I personally much rather go into those kinds of conversations than
yeah.
like the conversations of like you just need to go to church, repent, go through the. It's like that's I don't know. I don't agree. I think it's just like overly simplistic. It's like a very authoritarian, but
Yeah.
it's also like it's very paternalistic of like just do what I tell you to do. And there's a lot of people that are
Yeah.
like, well, no. Like, no, that's not going to work for you.
Exactly.
Coercion
Yeah.
isn't, I don't think coercion's really like the way forward with if you want to get people to the word. I don't, that's not
Yeah. I
my
mean, how could it
approach.
be genuine? I don't
Yeah.
see how it could be genuine. People have to live their own unique, genuine, sincere lives, and for some people that's following Christianity, for some it's Hinduism or Buddhism,
Yeah.
for some it's atheism. That's fine. I think we need a pluralistic society, and then just the appropriate laws to sort of keep everyone in check. And I see what you're saying about wanting to sort of be accepting in the church and giving examples for people. I think that may be true to some degree, but like with the drunkard example, you're not like bringing someone who's drunk on stage and being like, you know, I think it's a
Yeah.
little different. I think with some of these churches, and I don't know, maybe it's just because I've seen it on the internet and then living in Portland, I've seen it a lot where they have like practical shrines to George Floyd, and it goes above and beyond, in my opinion, to just wanting to be welcoming. To me, it seems like at least I don't know what the percentage is, but at least a certain percentage of you can use the word church, but obviously there are many, divisions and different sects and that sort of thing. But some of them certainly have been kind of hijacked. I think
I think so
just
too.
like with secular people, their
Yeah.
morality got hijacked by wokeness.
For sure. No, I think I was steel manning the best I could. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
I think
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
definitely like that very real element of like people buying into this. And so they're not following, what you're supposed to do, which is like follow the Bible. They're not following that, or they're interpreting it in
Mm,
such a way that they've been possessed by this ideology too, which clearly people have. People
yeah,
who have other ideologies, have adopted it. So
right.
real problem. So where can people like where is this going to be released? Where can people find it? Like how do we
Yeah.
check this thing out?
Yeah, so Uncomfortable Truths, the first episode comes out this Saturday or February 22nd, and it'll be both on YouTube and on X. If you follow at Become the Signal, that's my YouTube and
Oh, cool.
Twitter or X handle. So if you look that up, you can see it there, and then I'll have supplemental material, and then eventually, hopefully, the next episode will come out. But the first one's a good, 45-minute long, really good kind of like foundational. Um, Hopefully will provide a foundational understanding for what's going on with this and paint a better path forward for people.
Yeah. All right. Love it, man. Yeah. No, this is a great conversation. It's really important what you're doing. And I know you put a lot of work into it. So let's get it out there. And then at least, Socrates said, I can't teach anybody anything. I can just get them to think. So if you just get them to think, I think that we're on the right
That's the
path.
goal.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
Travis,
yeah.
thank you so much. This was a great conversation, man. I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise, yeah, I appreciate it so much.
All right.
It's been
Yeah.
great.
Thanks for listening, guys.